I found the first anomaly in a hospital record. A date that didn't fit. At first I shrugged, but the next one appeared, and then another. Each timestamp was a whisper. She had been living a parallel life while I documented ours, oblivious. And yet the taste of betrayal was as clear as the metal in my mouth. The year was 2018, and I lived on a quiet street in Boulder, Colorado, in a house that had been chosen for its logic rather than its charm. It was close to my office, close to the highway, far enough from downtown to avoid noise. The mortgage payment went out on the first of every month. Utilities were on automatic draft. The lawn was cut every other Saturday. Inside the garage, tools were hung in measured intervals. The structure of my life was stable, symmetrical, and predictable, like a well-calibrated system that had passed all stress tests. I had worked for an engineering firm for 11 years. My days were built from schedules, deliverables, and deadlines. I trusted sequences and tolerances more than intuition. At home, the same logic applied. My marriage had lasted 9 years. We shared accounts, calendars, routines. Everything important was documented, categorized, and stored. From the outside, there was nothing that suggested failure. What had changed was not visible. It was the pressure inside the system. Intimacy had been absent for almost a year. At first, it had been explained by workload, by fatigue, by long hours and business travel. Then by headaches, by stress, by the need for space. The reasons were reasonable, and I accepted them the way I accepted delays in a project, as temporary deviations that would be corrected once conditions normalized. But the conditions never normalized. The gap became a constant. Silence replaced touch. Evenings were spent in parallel, not together, like two machines operating in the same facility without sharing power. I did not interpret this as a crisis. I recorded it as a parameter shift, a change in output without an obvious cause. The house remained orderly. Mornings followed the same sequence: coffee, news, shower, commute. Evenings returned to the same pattern: dinner, email, sleep. There were no arguments, no raised voices, no visible fractures. Only a thinning of presence, like air slowly leaking from a sealed room, too gradual to trigger an alarm. The first irregularity appeared in the form of paper. One afternoon, I came home earlier than usual. A meeting had been canceled, and I used the extra time to review design files on my laptop at the kitchen table. On the counter, next to a stack of mail, lay a set of medical documents. They were partially covered by an envelope, but the printed header and a few numbers were visible. I had no intention of reading them. It was simply that my eyes, trained to notice figures and dates, registered them automatically. The dates did not align with what I knew. There were timestamps, test results, reference ranges, and a sequence of visits that extended back further than they should have. The format was standard, clinical, precise. Nothing in them was dramatic. No highlighted warnings, no urgent notes, just data. But the timeline suggested a process that had begun at a point when, according to the internal calendar of our marriage, no such process should have been possible. I did not feel shock. I felt the same sensation I had felt many times at work when a calculation produced a value that fell outside expected parameters. A quiet pause. A moment of rechecking assumptions. I looked at the papers again, more carefully this time, not to invade privacy, but to verify the anomaly. The sequence of dates formed a progression. Each entry depended on the previous one. The intervals between them were consistent. The system they described was functioning normally. The problem was not in the data. It was in my model of reality. I folded the corner of the top page not as a marker, but as a reflex, and placed the documents back where they had been. Then I returned to my laptop. The design file on the screen no longer held my attention. My mind had shifted into diagnostic mode. In engineering, when a structure shows no visible damage but its internal measurements indicate stress, you do not panic. You begin by isolating variables. You review baselines. You compare current readings with historical ones. You do not assign meaning yet. You confirm accuracy. That evening passed without incident. The house remained quiet. The routines continued. There was nothing in behavior that contradicted the surface stability. But the earlier observation remained, suspended in my awareness like an unresolved equation. I did not confront. I did not ask. At that stage, there was nothing to confront. There was only a discrepancy between two timelines that should have been synchronized but were not. The realization did not arrive as a suspicion of betrayal. It arrived as the recognition of a misalignment, the way a beam can be slightly off level while the building still stands. The structure looks intact. The load is still carried. But the angle is wrong, and over time, that angle will matter. I went to bed that night with the same calm I carried into every other night. The same ceiling above me, the same darkness, the same measured breathing in the room. Yet somewhere beneath the visible order, a small deviation had been recorded. Not an accusation, not a conclusion, just the first data point that did not fit the established pattern. The system had not failed. But it was no longer perfectly aligned. I did not ask questions. Questions implied emotion, and emotion introduced noise. I began with recording. At first, it was informal. I noted times and places the way I noted meetings at work, without attaching meaning. Departure in the morning. Return in the evening. Claimed errands. Claimed overtime. Claimed traffic. Each statement created a time window, and each window had boundaries. I wrote them down in a small notebook I kept in my desk drawer, the same one I use for technical sketches and measurements. Then I moved to digital traces. Digital systems are honest in ways people are not. They do not conceal intention, only record activity. Location pings, transaction timestamps, access logs. Each event leaves a residue. Individually, they mean little. In sequence, they form a pattern. I did not spy. I correlated. There is a difference. Spying looks for secrets. Correlation looks for consistency. Phone records showed movement during hours that were described as stationary. A grocery receipt appeared on a day when dinner had been ordered in. A rideshare charge aligned with an address that was not part of our normal geography. None of these elements proved anything in isolation. Together, they created a second timeline running parallel to the one I was being told. I did not experience anger. Anger requires certainty. I was still in the phase of verification. In structural analysis, when two models of the same system produce different stress distributions, you do not discard one immediately. You refine both. You increase sampling. You look for convergence. So I increased sampling. I began logging days the way air traffic control logs flights. Arrival times, departure times, claimed destinations, actual GPS movement, duration gaps. I did not interfere. I did not test. I did not provoke. I allowed the system to operate under normal load. The pattern stabilized quickly. There were recurring absences framed as routine, late meetings, errands, unexpected obligations. Each explanation occupied the same linguistic category: reasonable, unspecific, resistant to verification. The corresponding movement data, however, converged on the same small cluster of locations, none of which were connected to work, family, or necessity. It was not chaos. It was structure. That realization was the first moment something close to emotion surfaced. But it was not pain. It was clarity. The same clarity that comes when a noise in a signal resolves into a waveform. The randomness disappears. The shape becomes visible. I did not yet assign intent. Intent is a human interpretation layered on top of mechanical fact. What I had were coordinates, times, repetitions. I printed the logs and placed them in a folder. Not hidden, not displayed, simply stored, the way archive blueprints are stored, for reference, not reaction. The next step was redundancy. I installed a location sync application under the pretext of family safety. The justification was accepted without resistance. Systems that are not threatened do not object to monitoring. The data stream became continuous. From that point forward, there were no gaps, only movement. The cluster of coordinates resolved into a single address. I drove past it once, slowly, during daylight, as if it were a site under preliminary inspection. An apartment building. Standard construction. Nothing distinctive. No visible significance. Just another node in the city's grid. but repetition gives meaning to the ordinary. I did not stop. I did not park. I did not observe windows. That would have crossed from analysis into surveillance. I already had what I needed: confirmation of convergence. The second timeline had a fixed anchor. Two systems were now fully mapped: the one I was told about, and the one that actually existed. They no longer overlapped. I waited, not because I was unsure, but because timing is a variable like any other. In controlled testing, you do not interrupt a process at the first sign of deviation. You let it run long enough to reveal its full behavior. Weeks passed. The routines remained stable. The same departures, the same explanations, the same coordinates repeating with mechanical regularity. The second system did not correct itself. It refined itself. There was no longer a question of anomaly. There was only confirmation. During this period, my external behavior did not change. Meals were shared. Conversations continued. Plans were discussed. Laughter occurred at appropriate moments. None of it was false. It was simply incomplete. A model can be internally consistent and still omit a critical variable. I prepared quietly. Finances were separated in stages that looked like routine optimization. Accounts reviewed. Automatic payments reassigned. Documents copied. Digital backups created. Legal consultations scheduled under neutral pretexts. In every step, I followed the same principle: no sudden load shifts. No visible stress. The folder in my desk grew thicker. Logs, screenshots, timestamp records. Not for confrontation. For continuity. For the future version of myself who would need objective reference when memory tried to soften or reinterpret. Memory is a biased narrator. Data is not. The moment of confirmation came not through discovery, but through pattern completion. A holiday period. A time when routines should have changed. Instead, the same absences occurred, the same address, the same duration. The system did not adapt to context. It simply repeated. That is when I knew there was no scenario in which the two timelines would reemerge. In engineering, when a fault line is identified and its movement rate is measured, the question is no longer if separation will occur, but when. You do not argue with tectonics. You design for them. I selected the date. Not impulsively. Not in response to emotion. I chose a point of minimal disruption, when professional obligations were light, when external pressures were low, when logistical transitions could be executed cleanly. On that morning, nothing outward marked it as different. Breakfast was routine. The weather was ordinary. The calendar showed no significance. Yet internally, the process had reached its final phase. I did not rehearse speeches. Speeches are for persuasion, and persuasion implies negotiation. There would be none. I prepared a single document, clear, factual, time-stamped, a summary of the parallel system, presented without accusation, without adjectives, without interpretation. Just sequence. When the moment came, I placed the folder on the table and said only that there was something they needed to read. I did not watch their face. I watched the clock. Because at that point, the outcome was already determined. The data had closed the loop. The model was complete. The system had been observed. The deviation had been confirmed. And now, it was time to separate the structures. Silence followed while the pages were turned. Not the kind of silence filled with tension, but the kind that appears when a process reaches a result that can no longer be altered. Each line removed another possibility of reinterpretation. Each timestamp eliminated another refuge of ambiguity. I remained seated, hands on the table, posture unchanged. This was not restraint, it was equilibrium. When the reading ended, there was a pause, as if the system itself were recalculating, searching for an alternate output. None existed. The data set was closed. Explanations were attempted, not denials. Reframing, context, emotional qualifiers. Language designed to introduce uncertainty into what had already been reduced to sequence and measurement. I listened the way an engineer listens to a machine that is operating outside tolerance, attentively, but without negotiation. Human language is adaptive. It seeks gradients, exceptions, emotional margins. But a timeline does not respond to persuasion. It only confirms order. I acknowledged nothing beyond receipt. No argument. No counterpoints. No raised voice. Engagement would have implied that the conclusion was still under discussion. It was not. The document on the table was not an accusation. It was a record. I stated the outcome in one sentence, not as a threat, not as an ultimatum, as a status update. From that moment, the environment changed. The same room, the same furniture, the same light. But the relational structure that had occupied the space was no longer load-bearing. It had become a shell, temporarily standing, already scheduled for dismantling. Logistics followed. Keys were exchanged. Access was redefined. Temporary schedules were established for physical separation. These were not emotional acts. They were mechanical ones, like isolating circuits before removing a component. There was a question about forgiveness. It was framed as a possibility, a future variable, something that might alter the system if allowed to enter. I did not reject it emotionally. I excluded it structurally. Forgiveness implies continuation. Continuation was no longer part of the design. That night, I slept elsewhere. Not in anger, not in exile, in transition. The following weeks unfolded with procedural clarity. Legal steps, administrative changes, the division of shared systems into independent ones, utilities separated, accounts closed or reassigned, personal effects cataloged and moved. There were moments of visible distress on the other side, tears, appeals, attempts to reintroduce uncertainty into the now stable model. I did not mirror them, not out of coldness, out of coherence. My internal state had already completed the process, they were only beginning. In every interaction, I maintained the same parameters: factual, limited, time-bound. No revisiting of causes, no emotional postmortems. Those belong to narratives that continue. This one had reached its terminus. When the final papers were signed, the act itself felt anticlimactic. No surge of relief, no triumph, just closure, the way a completed circuit returns to neutral potential. The system was now fully separated. Two timelines, once forced to coexist, now ran independently, no longer intersecting. The deviation had been acknowledged. The structure had been dismantled. And what remained was not loss, but stability. I moved into a small apartment on the western slope of Denver, the windows framing the distant Rockies. The space was ordered differently, minimal yet complete, with surfaces cleared of unnecessary objects, each belonging assigned to a precise location. I established a new rhythm. Morning runs through quiet streets, the air sharp with winter cold or perfumed by spring blossoms, followed by hours at the engineering firm, each task structured, tracked, and completed in sequence. Evenings were measured, the light shifting across the room marking the passage of time. Silence no longer heavy but neutral, a stabilizing element rather than a pressure point. The routines created a framework around me, predictable and reliable. Meals were planned, errands scheduled, and work deadlines anticipated. I recorded expenditures and logged personal projects, noting progress without emotional weighting. Even memory followed a system. Past events were indexed, stored, and referenced only when necessary, analyzed as data points rather than sources of agitation. The apartment became a monitor for my life, a controlled environment where every variable was accounted for. Occasionally, traces of the previous life appeared: an email from an old acquaintance, a news item about the neighborhood. But they were peripheral, like background noise in a laboratory. I did not react beyond observation and recording. Each moment of reflection was brief, cataloged, and filed. The separation and procedural closure allowed this detachment. A year had passed, and the structure of daily life had stabilized. I could move without hesitation, make decisions without doubt, and rest without interruption. There was no urgency, no hidden conflicts, no unrecorded deviations. The system was self-contained, resilient, and predictable. The final observation was simple. Balance had been restored. The home, the schedule, and my own habits formed an interlocking network that functioned reliably. I did not feel triumph or relief, only the quiet confirmation that the environment, internal and external, operated as intended. Every task completed, every step logged, every memory archive contributed to this equilibrium. Stability was no longer fragile. It had become inherent, a structural property of life itself.